Our Father Whose Art Ain't Heaven is the pretty brilliantly titled 8th episode of the 4th season of Frasier. This is directed by Jeff Melman, and as always there will be spoilers from now as I go through the episode and share some thoughts. And this is a pretty great episode. It gets quite emotional on a few occasions, actually. And there's one point where I was genuinely so close to tears. And then about 5 seconds later, I was howling with laughter. And it's just absolutely magnificent. It starts off with Niles, Martin and Frasier coming home from seeing a film. And Martin was a bit upset because he'd said he'd wanted to pay for the tickets, but Frasier didn't let him. And then Niles is briefly talking about Maris. Daphne comes in and she says that she's going to cook them sheep's head stew for dinner. And it's not as bad as it sounds. It's actually more of a soup, which I thought was rather funny. And Martin, Frasier and Niles very quickly decide to leave the apartment because they have other plans. And we find out that actually this was just a ruse for Daphne to get them out of the house. We're then down in a restaurant. And Martin says that he's going to pay for dinner since he wasn't allowed to pay for the film tickets. And Frasier says, okay. After trying to dissuade him for a little bit, he finally agrees. And then we have this glorious moment where Martin looks down at the menu. And I think there's a great lesson there that if you're going to offer to pay for something, you might want to check the prices out first, because this is obviously a restaurant chosen by Frasier and Niles, not the kind of place Martin would usually go to. The following day, Martin then apologises for the way he overreacted, and while I think he was fair to feel not great about the fact he's never allowed to pay for anything, he did overreact in the situation, and he's bought Frasier a gift to make up for it. And he presents this giant painting of a matador and a bull, and personally, I do not like it. I think there will be some people who really like that style. It's not for me. And clearly, it's not for Frasier, but Frasier doesn't say anything because he doesn't want to hurt Martin's feelings. And I don't disagree with that. I don't think automatically going, oh my goodness, that's hideous, why did you get me that, would be the right approach in the situation. So I don't blame Frasier for not saying anything. We're then down at KCL, and we get a pretty funny anecdote from Roz about how she was once sent a ceramic hippo as a gift, and because she didn't say, oh my goodness, that's hideous, why did you get me that, she then started to receive ceramic hippos every single year. And Frasier realises that if he doesn't tell Martin this, he might end up getting more paintings over time. And while I'm sure Ross was able to stuff the hippos in a closet, Frasier lives with Martin. It's not going to be easy to hide those paintings. We are then back in the apartment. Martin got Niles a wine rack because he felt bad for getting Frasier something and not Niles. And Niles says very casually it didn't fit in with his decor. And Martin was like, okay, fine, I'll take it back. As easy as that. So Frasier thinks, well, if it was that easy for Niles to say that and Martin wasn't offended, maybe he can tell him that he doesn't like the painting. And he asks Martin, did Niles not hurt your feelings? And Martin says, I'm glad he told me. I don't want to give him something he doesn't like, which I think is a pretty fair response. So Frasier thinks, okay, I will tell Martin, and he does. He tells him the painting. He was very polite about it. He said art is very personal. What is one person's taste is not necessarily another person's, which I think was definitely the right approach. And then Martin is sobbing in the fridge. And this is particularly difficult to see because we don't see Martin crying that often. We don't see him getting upset that often. He might get angry or frustrated, but to be genuinely hurt by something is very rare. And then Frasier starts crying because Martin is crying, and I'm sitting there thinking this is very difficult to watch. And Martin points out we do get comedy throughout this. Martin says, I didn't even cry when I got shot, which doesn't sound funny, but in the moment it definitely was. And then Niles comes into the living room to just this scene of Martin and Frasier crying, and Niles is very confused by this, and he says rather adorably, why is everybody crying? And then it got really emotional, and I was generally thinking this has to change or I'm going to start weeping. And Frasier cries, I'm the most ungrateful son there is, and Martin cries, I can never do anything for my sons. And then this is the bit It is funny, I promise. This is the bit that had me howling with laughter. I was on the verge of tears. And then Niles says, "No one wants to come to my party." And at that point, I was cackling with laughter. I actually rewound it and watched it again because it was just so perfect. And honestly, I was on the verge of crying, really like sobbing at the scene. And then Niles just managed to completely turn that around, which I thought was pretty fantastic. It's then much later at night, and Martin says he kind of explains why he got upset, and it's because he finally thought they had something in common, that they both liked the painting. And Frasier goes into this anecdote about how when he was a child, he was playing with Martin's badge, his police badge, and Martin told him it's not a toy, it's a symbol of something very important, and that every time Martin put this badge on afterwards, Frasier thought very highly of his father because putting that badge on meant his father was doing something really important, and how Frasier tried to emulate this as an adult, and potentially that's why he went into psychiatry to help people. And it's really beautiful and really sweet. And Martin says, "I may have something else to give you." And we have the suspense for maybe half a minute as he goes to get whatever this is. Frasier takes a moment to try and appreciate the painting, but it doesn't work. And Martin comes in and hands him this box. And honestly, I don't love how this played out. They were definitely going for comedy. They definitely tried to make it funny. But I feel like it should have just been sentimental. And there are two ways they could have done this. So I'll explain what happens and explain what I think I would have preferred. Martin hands Frasier a box, and Frasier thinks it's Martin's badge. He thinks, "You've given me your and then changes it to bolo tie. I had never heard of bolo ties, or at least I didn't know what that name was. So I googled that, gave me a bit of education, always like that. And we find out that this bolo tie actually once belonged to Frasier's grandfather. I believe he got it when he retired, and then he gave it to Martin when he graduated, and now he's giving it to Frasier, who will one day give it to Freddie. And that's lovely. That's really sweet. But I don't like the fact that we had this moment where Frasier thought he was getting the badge, because that would have been a genuinely beautiful moment. And I think they kind of ruined it. I think we needed that moment of Frasier and Martin just having a nice, problem-free bonding moment where Martin is finally able to do something for Frasier that Frasier genuinely appreciates. And getting the badge would have been something he really appreciated. I'm not saying, though, that Martin should have given him the badge. I think the best scenario would have been Frasier never suspecting it was the badge. And he opens it unsure of what it is, realizes it's the bolo tie, realizes the significance. Maybe he remembers his grandfather wearing it. I don't know. There are ways that we could have made it more sentimental, and I think that would have been better, and I think that would have been more powerful. I don't think they needed to try and put some comedy in there with Martin being shocked afterwards that Frasier thought that he was getting the badge. And I mean, they could have kept that in, actually. They could have had this beautiful moment with the bolo tie and Frasier remembering his grandfather wearing it, or maybe remembering Martin wearing it, and it could have been really beautiful and moving. And then Martin could have said at the end, "But if you think you're getting my badge, you'll have to prize that out of my cold, dead hands," which is what he basically said. So they could have kept that in without ruining the moment. So I don't think they did the best thing there, at least from what I would have wanted from this. I really wanted that moment to just be Martin giving Frasier something he really appreciated, because that's what Martin was trying to do throughout the whole episode. And I honestly think they kind of ruined it. But they could have kept the badge thing in after the fact and got that comedy in there, that line from Martin that was quite funny, without ruining the more sentimental, moving moment. So definitely not perfect, but that aside, I thought Our Father Whose Art in Heaven is brilliantly done, very emotional, but also very funny. Niles is absolutely fantastic. Ultimately, although it may not have been perfect right at the end, I still think that this is a pretty fantastic episode.